Hello, and welcome to Conversations in Culture and Evolution. I am your host, Carles Salazar, a work group of the Catalan Institute of Anthropology that goes with the name of Culture and Evolution. And in this work group, we are some social anthropologists and archaeologists, and happy with the way in which our disciplines were treating Darwinian theory of evolution and in general, the relationship between biology and culture in the study of human behavior. And to compensate for this deficiency, we have organized this group. Today, our guest is Professor Stephen Mithen from the University of Reading. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, nice to be with you.
Welcome to Conversations in Culture and Evolution. Now, Stephen Mithen is Professor of Early History at the University of Reading, having studied at the Universities of Sheffield, York, and Cambridge. His academic career at Reading since 1992 has involved managerial roles as Vice-Chancellor, International and Research, and Deputy Vice-Chancellor. His teaching and research interests concern human evolution, hunter-gatherers, and the emergence of farming, with long-term field projects in southern Jordan and western Scotland. He was elected as a Fellow of the British Academy in 2003. Stephen has been one of the pioneers of cognitive archaeology, drawing on research within psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy of mind for the interpretation of the archaeological record. His current project, Saying the Word, focuses on the relationship between words, thought, and cultural evolution. And here we have some of the books. I don't know if you can see the screen. This is just a small sample of the books written by Stephen. As you can see from the titles, they all extremely interesting. Now, Stephen, let me ask you the question that we ask all our guests. In what way has Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection been relevant to your research, and in what way do you think it's relevant to archaeological research?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much first for inviting me to your discussions. It's an enormous pleasure and privilege to be here. Yeah, Darwinian theory, I think it's got to be absolutely fundamental, because there's a basic fact that we as human beings, as Homo sapiens, are a product of biological evolution. And Darwinian theory provides the principal explanation for how biological evolution has occurred. And that biological evolution has given us both the opportunities, it's enabled us to behave and to think in various ways, and it also constrains us as well. So, if you like, it provides an envelope within which we can explore the immense diversity and variety of human behavior. And I think it's so important for anybody working in the human sciences, whether in archaeology or whether in the humanities or any other area of social sciences, to be aware and take account and to be compatible with Darwinian theory, because especially in the world today, it's critical that we emphasize our continuity with the natural world, continuity with other species, rather than our separation from them. So whereas biological evolution cannot give us all the answers about being human, what it means to be human, I think it gives us a lot of those. There are ones that I think are particularly important to stress, especially at this time of the way the planet is and the way society is. So it provides me with a framework that I'm very comfortable within.
Good. Well, I suppose in archaeology it might be different, but in the field of anthropology, sometimes if you mention the word Darwin, I mean, you feel an awful lot of I don't know,
Disquiet.
refusal,
Yes, indeed.
disquiet, or
Yeah, yes.
you know.
It's the same in archaeology. And I don't think this is surprising, because Darwinian theory, or the application of Darwinian theory to human society, has not had a good history. As we know, it's been used by various people in the past to support particular views of humans about them being maybe aggressive or particularly selfish, or as a part of an explanation for subtle racism and so forth. And of course, they are views that I, and I'm sure you and everybody, would totally reject. So it does have a rather difficult history, and some of those thoughts linger on in the minds of some people who don't really grasp what the nature of Darwinian theory is. And it's not providing anything, I think, profound or provocative. Well, it's profound, but not profoundly negative in any way. It's simply saying that during the course of human evolution, and we can apply it to culture as well, there is variability created within human behavior and the way we think and the things we make. And some of those are selected and survive, and some don't. It's not providing any moral judgment at all. It's simply trying to describe what happens. And of course, whereas we can apply it to much of human evolution, there are areas where it's constrained, because humans choose how they behave with intentionality, and trying to understand how the intentional aspects of human behavior and human thought engage with Darwinian theory is one of the interesting areas of research. But to throw at Darwinian theory because of a rather negative history would be a great mistake. And I think that leads to some of the division with the natural world today that ultimately justifies or allows some of the great degradation of the natural world that humans are engaged with at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose when thinking about the relevance of Darwinian theory to study humans, we can make the distinction between the biological and the cultural. I suppose we all accept that, biologically speaking, we should use Darwinian theory.
Yes.
What about cultural evolution? I mean, because at one stage, I mean, I was very skeptical about the idea of cultural evolution. I was brought up in this kind of Boasian view of culture. Culture is history. Cultures do not evolve. But then I was very impressed by the models that they produce. All these mathematical models are really beautiful models. But I am half converted, because on the other hand, when I look for examples of, say, particular cultural institutions that can be accounted for by means of Darwinian evolution, that's not easy, isn't it? I mean, well, I find it difficult. I don't know.
It is difficult, but the way I see it is that with humans, and I'm sure with many other animals at all, you cannot make an absolute distinction between biology and culture. And the reason for that is that when we were born and we grow up and we develop within a cultural environment, and that cultural environment influences our biology. At its most basic, our genes inside of us, the ones we inherit, their expression is dependent upon the cultural environment that we live in. So the way our brains get networked together through genes expressing themselves in the development of neural networks, that is dependent on the environment that we're in. If you take a young child and you put them in a very socially, isolated context where they don't get to talk and engage with other people, their brains will develop in a very different way. They won't acquire language as we do, for instance. If you put people in a very rich, stimulating environment, their brains will become connected in different ways. They will have a different biology at the end of it. So I don't think you can have any strict distinction between biology and cultural evolution, because culture influences how our genes are expressed. I'm like you, I'm less comfortable with talking about the Darwinian competition between types of societies, I always like to go down to the individual level and see what's happening at that level. I'm not comfortable with applying Darwinian to, how one type of society is necessarily has greater survival value than another society. I think we need to work at the micro level.
Right, right. Now, what about this new science that was born at the end of the 20th century that goes by the name of evolutionary psychology?
Yes.
Evolutionary psychologists use Darwinian evolution because they say that the very hardwired deep behaviors that we can see in humans that seem not to be adaptive to our current environment, they were adaptive to what they call the environment evolutionary adaptiveness, which is supposed to be what happened in the Pleistocene.
Yes.
But very little research actually is done in the Pleistocene to justify this claim. So what do you think of this view?
I have both I'm both attracted to and partly repelled from evolutionary psychology. I can see both positives and negatives.
Right.
I think it's undeniably the case that aspects of human physiology and aspects of the way we think were conditioned by our hunter-gatherer past. I mean, the obvious example is looking at issues of diet and food use in the world today. We are all attracted to what are now very unhealthy foods: sugars and fats, sugars, chocolates, sweets, crisps, alcohol, all these things that are unhealthy for us, that are creating huge amounts of obesity, diabetes, illness in the modern world. And yet we are attracted to having them. Even when we know that they're causing us harm, we tend to eat them still. And I think the argument that this derives from a mentality that's structured from a hunter-gatherer past, when these foods were rare, were important to eat, is very compelling. So I feel that example shows that there is something in this evolutionary psychology, because how else could you explain this bizarre behavior? And I think we can see it in other aspects of human behavior as well, such as our love of language. I think that evolves from an evolutionary past, the way we talk, the way we interact with people. So I find that there's some aspects of human behavior that evolutionary psychologists draw upon to justify their views is quite compelling. What I don't like is how they characterize this environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, because they say, oh, that's what it was like 2 million years ago in the African savannah. They have no evidence for that. They have a very naive view of what hunter-gatherers' life was like. Whereas as anthropologists, we know it was rich and diverse and varied. And some of these propensities we have today probably evolved all at different times, some much earlier than hunter-gatherers in the Pleistocene, probably go way back, hundreds of million years in our evolutionary history, and some, I think, much more recently. So the quality of research in evolutionary psychology, I think, tends to be rather poor. But there is some compelling argument there that much of our behavior, our physiology, some of our mentality is conditioned, constrained by our hunter-gatherer past. It doesn't mean that we can't get over it. I mean, we can stop eating these foods. We can reflect on how we behave and how we talk and think about people and so forth. So we do have this degree of self-control, of free will, of initiative, if you like. And I think all of that can partly override what evolutionary psychologists tell us do. But if we take our foot off the pedal, we can lapse back into those frame of mind.
Right. Talk about the human species.
Yes.
in a conversation that we had some months ago with your fellow archaeologist and our fellow countryman, Eudald Carbonell, we asked him what is a distinctive characteristic of the human species.
Yes.
And well, we thought that he would mention the language or culture or cumulative culture. But no, I mean, what he said was what is distinctive is the harnessing of fire.
Right.
Only humans can do that. No other species can do that. Well, and other than humans, our hominins ancestors also could do that. So how would you define our species?
Well, clearly, yes, humans are the only species that makes fire. Equally, the only species that live in houses and drive motor cars and play chess and things like that. I would say one word: language. I think language is the big defining difference between humans and all other species. If you take our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees, great apes, we shared an ancestor with them, well, between 6 and 8 million years ago. Now, we once had a long list of features that distinguish us from chimpanzees. We had tool use, we had social complexity, we had walking on 2 legs, we had language. Now, all of those now have clearly some trace in chimpanzees. They do sometimes walk on 2 legs, or, you know, they move around with arms, at least on 2 legs. We know there's a lot of tool use. We know there's cultural transmission. We know about the complexity of their social interactions today. They don't have language, and I don't think they have anything that's remotely like language. Now, that doesn't mean that their vocal communications aren't complex, don't have some degree of intentionality, they aren't learnt partly. They have all of those features, but they're not like words. And I think words and language really ultimately transforms the brain, transform the mind. And it's been the evolution of language that's gradually pulled us away from the apes and set us up as what we see as quite a distinctive species. And language and fire, for instance, making fire, controlling fire, I don't think you can do that if you haven't got language. Equally, you can't make complex stone tools with that language. You can't build motor cars and drive them with that language. So I think language is the ultimate defining characteristic. Yeah. And trying to understand how language evolved and how it's changed the nature of the human mind and thought is, I think, one of the biggest challenges, the most interesting challenges that we face as academics.
That's absolutely fascinating topic. But before dealing with language, well, you have written this book, The Singing Neanderthal,
yes,
in which you put forward, well, you mention another capacity, which is musicality,
yes,
which would be something that came before language, but that, in a way, I think you were criticizing Steven Pinker's idea that musicality was, what did he call it? The cheesecake of...
He called it a cheesecake. Yeah, that's right.
Cheesecake of the mind, or something that has no adaptive value.
Yeah, that's right.
A byproduct. But you
that's
think
right.
No, it was a very fundamental form of communication.
Yes, I think so. I think it still is today. You know, I remember reading Steven Pinker's book, and he wrote music is a cheesecake of the mind. I thought, that's ridiculous. How could anybody think that? Because music is found universally in all human societies. Babies, before they have any inkling of language, they can entrain to rhythm, and they prefer to listen to music than talk. And to all of us, we know how music can move us emotionally. So the idea that it doesn't have a profound evolutionary basis is just crazy. I couldn't understand how we come to that view. And of course, writers from the Enlightenment onwards, you know, Rousseau and then from Darwin, they'd all spoken about the, you know, where did music come from, and compared it to like the singing of songbirds and so forth. But what I thought, nobody had actually tried to relate it to the specific course of human evolution. When did musicality, our ability to use rhythm and pitch and timbre to make sounds, when did that appear and why did it appear? So in my book, Singing the Antarctic, was trying to bring all the evidence together, trying to find out what we know about music in the brain, what we know about musicality in other animals, what we know about music in the human body and how it's expressed, to try and explore when did this ability to enjoy new music evolve and why. And what I argued is that in our human past, especially before language, it was a really important means of communication. It's if you like, if you take chimpanzee vocal communications now, and that we think are similar to those of a common ancestor, they use lots of rhythm, they use lots of variation pitch. So musicality is partly an extension of those. And it's really used, I think, for social bonding, for building trust between people, for communicating emotions. And we still use it for exactly those reasons today. So it's still got adaptive value. But because we have language, you can also communicate much in a much more effective way for information. So language also becomes a real good means for simply enjoyment and pleasure. It's sort of lost some of its adaptive value, but maintained others. But the way I see it in the world today is language is often a way of dividing societies and people. Some people speak Spanish, others speak English. Unless you're bilingual, you can't communicate. Within a society, some people speak in one dialect and one accent, others speak in another, and it's used to make barriers between people. Or some people speak in a very with very complex words, sophisticated words that others don't understand. It's a way of creating social distinctions. Music does exact opposite. Because it doesn't have an agreed meaning, it binds people together. I can listen to Spanish music and enjoy it just as much as a Spanish person can, and a Spanish person can listen to my English music and enjoy it just as much. So I think music, its key adaptive value is binding people together, bringing people together and bringing social bonds. Language, seems to me, risks doing the opposite, of creating boundaries between people. So I think they both play a really important functional role in human society, and we need both of them to have a really coherent and effective society today. I really enjoyed writing about music, and it persuaded me it's so fundamental to being human. Whether you play music and engage in music yourself, and I'm not particularly musical. I can't hold a tune, I can't dance in rhythm, but I know that music moves me profoundly in some ways, and I think it speaks to us of a very deep evolutionary past that we carry around with us today.
That's right. I mean, we can enjoy songs, even songs that we don't understand the song, but
absolutely,
still, I mean, we enjoy the
absolutely.
the song.
Yeah, even if you don't understand the meaning of the words.
Yeah.
It's just it's the rhythms, it's the melodies, it's the pitch, it's seeing other people enjoying it. It's so meaningful to us. It's so hugely important. So I couldn't understand how anybody could say it's just cheesecake, some trivia thing. It's not. It's the exact opposite of that, you know.
Yeah. And you put emphasis as well on the lullabies. I mean, the communication between the mother and the child.
Yes, yes, of course. Of course. Yes, indeed. I mean, that's so important. You know, before the child has any inkling of language, they're responding to musicality, mothers singing to them and rocking them. And you know, it's known now and actually that plays a role in learning language, because it's now known that when babies are born, they are happier learning to listen to their mother's language than somebody else's language, because they've gained the rhythm of that language. When in the womb, they've learned the rhythms of that particular language and they're familiar with it. So the musicality that they gain helps them ultimately learn the language of their community before they've got any idea about words and their meaning. It's a really, really very profound. Yeah. And there's nothing nicer, is there, than whether you're a mother or a father or a grandparent with a baby and singing and rocking with them. It's just the most amazing thing. I was doing it with my latest grandchild just at the weekend. She's only a few weeks old, and it's a way I could communicate with her. just by singing and by rocking. It was an amazing experience for both of us. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So musicality would be form of communication, therefore, that came before language. But then it comes language. I mean, that is the topic of your last book, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. I mean, I do see that there was originally a single form of communication, if you like, that had very strong musical elements and began to have strong elements that would call words, and they sort of bifurcated, went different ways, and we ended up one with musicality and one with language. I'd always, throughout my career, I've always been fascinated in how language could have evolved. It seemed to me the greatest puzzle, and in my early books, I never wrote about it directly because there were so many ideas out there, so much being written, and nobody was agreeing with anybody else, and ideas came and went. You know, going right back to Plato, he was writing about the invention of words, and then through the Enlightenment and up to Chomsky and so forth. But I suppose about 3 years ago, my reading, and I read quite widely and I monitor disciplines quite widely, and I began to think that in developments in a range of disciplines, in anthropology, social and biological anthropology, in neuroscience, what we're understanding about the brain and how the brain is formed, in genomics and our understanding of the genetics of language, in linguistics itself, and in archaeology, we were beginning to emerge with, I see each of these disciplines have different pieces of the puzzle for how language, you know, you can't explain language if you don't understand the genetics of language, or how language is manifested in the brain, or the course of human evolution. And it seemed to me about 3 years ago that each of these disciplines were finding evidence that I thought could be pieced together in a compatible way to create a new synthesis. So I've recently finished a new book called The Language Puzzle. And it's called a puzzle because I think each of the disciplines, neuroscience, linguistics, anthropology, genomics, archaeology, have a piece of the puzzle about how language evolved. And what I've tried to do in my new book is write about each of those puzzle pieces and suggest how they can all be linked together to create a new synthesis for how language evolved from 6 million years ago up to the present day. And that book's being published in the US in June next year, in the UK in March, and I'm hoping it's going to get some European publishers as well. Yeah, so, and that's sort of it's sort of built on my other books, Previously the Mind, Singing Neanderthals, and I'm very happy with the argument that I've made now.
So why do we have language then? Why is
why do we have language? We have it for all sorts of reasons. You know, I'm not. If you look in the literature, you know, some people have argued that we have language to transmit information about making stone tools, or to build social bonds, or to tell stories, or to, there's loads of different theories. It's got to be all of those. Language is such flexible. It's such a useful thing to have. I think there are lots of selective pressures on language. And the key thing is not the latter stage of language evolution. It's the first stage, is how words emerge from chimpanzee-like or ape-like vocalizations. And I think our first words were very much iconic words. Now, some iconic words are onomatopoeias, you know, but there's been a lot of research in linguistics lately about iconic words, which capture something of the essence of what they're talking about. So typically in languages, words for small things would be small words, like in English, ant and bee and pea, and big things would be great long words like rhinoceros and hippopotamus and enormous and so forth. And I think that in our early humans, Homo habilis and then Homo erectus, these sort of iconic words emerged from ape-like holistic calls, and gradually they got eroded down to become the first standalone words. And once you got the first words, then you have process of language change, historical linguistics contributes a lot to this, and those words gradually evolved into more iconic words, then became arbitrary words, and eventually abstract words through the course of a very slow gradual change. And we can see during the evolution how the types of words becomes more complicated, more wide-ranging. And it's not until Homo sapiens, about 100,000 years ago, that we get language as we know it today, with both iconic and concrete words, abstract words, arbitrary words, and the full syntax like we have today. So I think it was a long, slow evolution. And what we can track through the changes in stone tools, the changes in human behavior, such as making a fire, is how language is gradually becoming more complicated. And throughout that time, there were selective pressures, because just being able to communicate with others, transmit information, tell stories, was a really adaptive thing to do. So that's where the Darwinian evolution comes in. Those individuals who were better at forming words, learning words, communicating words, had a selected advantage. Ultimately, more of their genes got left into the next generation. And if we don't have that Darwinian perspective, we'll never explain the evolution of language. Going back to your early questions.
Yeah, because I mean, when you think about the evolution of language, there's always this paradox. I mean, if someone has the capacity to speak, but no one else has that capacity, I mean,
yeah, that's right. How could it start?
Yeah.
Now, so I think it has to start with what I call these iconic words that you intuitively know the meaning of. So if I talk about, if I'm looking and pointing something, I'm saying something like B, P, and T, you're intuitively going to think I'm looking at a small thing because I'm making a small sound.
Right.
Okay, so there's an intuitive understanding. You don't know the meaning of the word, but you gave the same sense. And whereas if I'm using my arms and saying, something enormous, a hippopotamus, and I'm making this thing, you have an intuitive understanding of what I'm meaning, even though you don't know the meaning of a word. So language has got to begin, I think, with these iconic words, because for the exact reason you say, because if I were to use a word and you don't know the meaning of it, how can we have a conversation? It's impossible. So once it starts, however, I think it then snowballs all by itself. It's that initial starting of language, which is the biggest challenge. When do the first words emerge? And I think that is way back in about 1.5 million years ago with Homo erectus. Yeah, Homo habilis and Homo erectus.
Good.
So by the time we get to the Neanderthals, I think they've got quite a complicated language. I think they're using a lot of grammar, they've got a lot of words, but what they're not using are abstract words, abstract concepts, and metaphors. And that's the big change we get with Homo sapiens.
Right. Now let's talk about human history. And well, when you look at the history of our species, I mean, you find certain irregularities or certain gaps. For instance, one of them is the emergence of what they call symbolic culture.
Yes.
The production of things which do not have a material utility, but are supposed to have some kind of symbolic, like cave art. Cave art would be the example, but that comes rather late. I mean, anatomically modern humans have maybe 200,000 years. This is much more recent. So why it took us so long?
There is a huge gap there. I mean, we have the first Homo sapiens. They're dated to about 350,000 years ago. The ones from in Morocco, but we know that from then up to about 100,000 years ago, the shape of the cranium is still evolving, because we have this process of this globularization. It's called this. Those early Homo sapiens, their brains are still quite elongated and flat, much like Neanderthals. Either our faces have become flat like Homo sapiens. But I don't think the fully modern brain is present until about 100,000 years ago. Now, at that time, and we know that soon after that we have Homo sapiens disperse again from Africa in this great diaspora. And I think that's when modern languages evolved. But it is strange, as you say, that we don't get any figurative art or clearly symbolic art at that time. We get some indications of it. We get a lot of use of red ochre. We get use of beads as shells, as body decoration. We get engravings. But figurative art doesn't appear until 40,000 years ago. I'm sure the capacity to make it must have been earlier. And my interpretation is that it's the interaction between those glaciated environments, particularly in Europe, during the Ice Age, with those immensely rich fauna, really stimulating, really exciting landscapes, but also the environmental challenges that the humans were facing. The winters must have been extremely harsh. And I think the cave art did have a functional role. It was a means by which people came together. They had ritual and beliefs, ceremonies that drew people together. And it was through that they built up the necessary social bonds that they could connect their societies to survive through those very challenging Ice Age conditions. But quite why it got expressed in figurative art is a really fascinating question that I don't think has been appropriately explained. And we know that just because you can make figurative art, many societies don't. I work on part of the excavations I undertake is in the Mesolithic hunter-gatherer communities of Britain. These dates after the start of the Holocene, up to about 5,000 years ago. They don't make any art at all, or none that have survived. I don't question they're not modern humans and they're not got symboling capacities, but their way of lives didn't, for some reason, didn't necessitate the making of really elaborate art like we find in Upper Paleolithic Europe.
Yeah. No, there are modern tribal societies that do not produce any.
No, it's not. It's not It's not a requirement of humans to do it.
That's right.
But we don't doubt everybody has that capability to do it if they're in the appropriate environment to do. Yeah.
Another gap, a very remarkable gap that we find in human history is the so-called Neolithic revolution, the agricultural revolution that took place 10,000 years ago. First, why it took us so long to make this agricultural revolution? It had to do with the climate, or
I think there's two factors. I mean, you're quite right. It's not until the earliest farming communities we find are in Southwest Asia at about 12,000 years ago. Okay. And then soon after that, we also find farming communities emerge in China at about 10,000 years ago. And then lots of different parts of the world all independently. You have them emerging in Papua New Guinea, where they domesticate bananas and taro, in Mesoamerica, where they cultivate corn and peppers and pumpkins. So it's amazing that within a few thousand years of the Holocene, agriculture is independently invented in all sorts of parts of the world. After hundreds of thousands of years, when there's no trace of it at all, people will live by hunting and gathering. Now, I think there's two factors for this. The first is clearly climate. Agriculture can only be sustained within this interglacial period we're in at the moment. We're in a period of relatively warm, wet, and stable climate, rather than going back to the Pleistocene, when every few thousand years, every 5-10,000 years, you're going back to glaciation. So any culture that's starting is getting knocked back. So one is the stable, warm, wet environments we're living in. But of course, we did have those environments in the past. We can go back to 120,000 years ago. There was an interglacial then. We didn't have agriculture invented at that time. We can go even further back, we didn't have agriculture invented. So you can't explain it only by climate itself. I think it was a combination of climate and modern humans with the modern human mind and particularly language. And in fact, what I argue in my new book, The Language Puzzle, is the invention of farming was a direct consequence of the new linguistic capabilities that modern humans had. After 70,000 years ago, when modern humans dispersed around the world, they were still living through the end of the Pleistocene. They were still relatively wet, cold, unstable climatic conditions. It was only after 12,000 years ago that the climate became relatively stable. Now, at that time, we've got modern humans with these really new creative capabilities in their minds. And I think what they're beginning to do is thinking about plants and animals in a metaphorical way. I think they start treating plants as if they were social beings, human beings, they're children. So they're starting to care for them. They're watering them. They're transplanting them. They're removing pests. They're caring for plants just as they care for their children. I think they're doing it with wild animals as well. The orphaned goats or wild cattle that they find, they're caring for them, bring them into their communities. Now, what that means is gradually those plants, those animals become domesticated, and humans become reliant on the productivity of them because they produce bigger grain, they're more reliable and so forth. So it's the application of this new metaphorical mind that comes from their linguistic abilities onto the natural world, which means people start interfering in the natural world, and that leads to domestication, ultimately agriculture. So it's that combination of climatic conditions and a human mind that allows people to think in this metaphorical way about the natural world. You put them together and you get the emergent domesticated species. And then very quickly we become entirely dependent on those species. So there's no going back. Once you invent agriculture, you can't go back. You become dependent on it. And hence we get the emergence of later complex societies. So that's how I see that scenario happening. The delay is because of the delay of the Pleistocene. When the Pleistocene finishes, that modern mind gets into action and invents agriculture very quickly.
Right, right. Yeah, because animism can be understood as a way of thinking symbolically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's exactly what I think they're doing. But when you're in the Pleistocene, you can think with animism, you can treat animals and plants sort of partly human, but because of the climatic conditions, it doesn't have any impact. But when you get into Holocene, that way of thinking, that way of behaving, just changes those animal species because it's warmer, it's wetter, it's climatically stable. So you get this big transformation that time.
Yeah. And what about the idea that has been recently popularized by Harari, amongst others, that was a big mistake. I mean, that the Neolithic revolution
What, farming?
Farming was a big mistake.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's easy to come up with that idea, and I have some sympathy with it, because there's no doubt that if we'd remained as hunter-gatherers, we would not be facing the climate crisis we are today. We would not be facing the immense loss of biodiversity. We'd not have social violent conflict around the world, because all of that is dependent upon farming, population growth, industry, burning of fossil fuels. So you might say, wow, what a great mistake that was. If only we'd remained as hunter-gatherers, we wouldn't be facing, the possible extinction of our species on the planet. But what else would we be missing? We'd also miss the music of Bach, wouldn't we? We wouldn't have Shakespeare. We wouldn't have science. We wouldn't have looked inside a brain or known about the structure of atoms. We wouldn't be exploring the universe. We wouldn't have any of these amazing achievements of art and science. I wouldn't be talking with you today across the world. Right. So farming brought all these wonderful achievements to humankind that we'd never have had if we'd lived as hunter-gatherers. So it's a mistake in one way, but another way, it's the greatest thing that we've ever done. And if we can use our human ingenuity now, and all this science and technology, all the social and political institutions that we've developed since we've had farming, to solve the climate crisis, to restore our landscapes and biodiversity, I think we might not look back on it as the greatest mistake we made, but one of the greatest achievements we've made. But at the moment, the future does look bleak. So I have some sympathy with it. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but still, I mean, if it seems that if you compare the living standards of hunter-gatherers in the Pleistocene or by the
Yeah.
end of the Pleistocene and the living standards of the first agriculturalists, it seems
Yeah,
that
that's
they
true.
were much worse.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, that transition to agriculture is quite difficult. I think a good argument is that it's about a good, strong Darwinian perspective on this, because some recent ethnographic studies who's looked at hunter-gatherers who have then settled down as farmers have shown that women are attracted to become sedentary farmers because that increases the number of offspring they have. As hunter-gatherers, they tend to be restricted to about one infant every 4 years because they have to carry them around all the time.
That's right. That's right.
Now, when you become a farmer, being sedentary, you can have more children, one every 2 years, one every 18 months. Now, the flip side of that is they're less healthy. More of them die. But on balance, even though more of your infants die, more of them will survive to put the genes of the next generation. So from a Darwinian perspective, it's to the advantage of a mother to become a sedentary farmer if possible. Just from a Darwinian perspective, putting their genes of the next generation, even though the majority of their infants may be less healthy, those that do survive will proliferate rather better.
Right.
So I'm quite
Right.
persuaded by that. But trying to understand that transition, you're absolutely right. It's a peculiar thing to have done. You know, it's not only your health, it's also all the political tensions that you get with living in sedentary communities.
Right.
It's a really big, interesting challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and as you said, I mean, there is no evidence that farming communities go back to the hunter-gatherer mode of subsistence.
No. I mean, I think there's evidence that people sometimes leave farming societies and go back as hunter-gatherers.
Right.
So, you know, there's a good case that some of the African San hunter-gatherers, their ancestors did spend some time as farmers and they went back to hunter-gathering way of life. But generally, you can't get that reversal because once you start farming, you become dependent upon the plants and the animals, and they depend on you. So it's for human societies in general, it's a path of no return. Yeah.
Right. And linked to this, the agricultural revolution, what about the origins of inequality? Because it seems that, well, the Marxist interpretation of history would be, well, inequality, to have inequality, you need surplus.
Yeah.
To have surplus, you need agriculture. I mean, there is no surplus in hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
But it seems that the first agriculturalists were not very unequal societies. They were subsistence agriculture, probably.
That's right.
Inequality came much later. What would be the...
Well, I see this sort of two ways. I mean, first of all, remember there is always biological inequality between people.
Yeah.
You know, just a genetic variation. Some people have bigger muscles, bigger lungs, bigger brains. There's always inequality in one regard between human, just from a biological basis. There's a random lottery of genes that we get, and some people are bigger, stronger, more beautiful, better looking and whatever than others. Okay, so there's always inequality there. And the idea that hunter-gatherers are perfectly egalitarian or perfectly equal or without any inequality is not right. There was never a golden age of no inequality. Equally, if you jump over the early farmers to sort of the late Neolithic, the Bronze Age, we can see that there are surplus being produced, and there is social inequality there. We think that's because some people have control of the surpluses. they control the flow of goods, they build up a power base and wealth and so forth. The earliest farmers are, as you're absolutely right, these are a bit of a conundrum, because as far as you can see, in many regards, they're still like hunter-gatherers. There's no traces of an elite or more powerful individuals. There's no sort of very rich burials. There seems to be communal sharing of grain and so forth. So it does look like the early farmers had social systems that were not significantly less unequal or unequal than hunter-gatherers. But I think what happens within those is that those then sow the seeds whereby inequality can develop, where those individuals who have a propensity to want to acquire wealth or to want to acquire a power base, agriculture gives them opportunity to do that. So you move from communal storage of grain to personal storage of grain, so people can't see what you've got and what you've harvested, so they don't know what to share. And the development of trade networks as communities become more sedentary gives an opportunity for people to control those networks. So I'd see it as the first farming communities are not particularly unequal, but they provide the platform for individuals to seek means to gain wealth and power. And then that becomes really manifest in the late Neolithic and Bronze Age and onwards, where it becomes very evident that there's unequal societies.
Right.
So again, you've got a process of cultural change that takes several thousand years. It's not instant. Yeah.
Right. Well, as you said, I mean, not all inequalities are material inequalities. I mean, there are all different kinds of inequalities, but there is one kind of inequality which is pervasive in all human societies, which is gender inequality.
Yeah.
As you know, I mean, feminist scholars normally talk about patriarchy, okay, and all bad things come from patriarchy. But how would you define yourself, patriarchy, and the origins of patriarchy? I mean, does it come from agricultural revolution or?
I don't know. It's very difficult. I find gender a really difficult issue to address in the past, because, you know, if we're dealing with a Paleolithic, like hand axe by face, we don't know if they're being made just by men, by women, or by both. And there's often assumptions made that they're being made by one gender, but we have no evidence of that. Equally, in the early farming communities, we don't know whether these are being run and organized by men or women or by both. What I have learned by my studies on evolution of language, by looking at modern day linguistics, is that females often are the innovators in language change. So I think possibly in language and possibly in other areas of culture, females were often the drivers of change in the past. That doesn't help, obviously that doesn't explain where patriarchy comes from and when it emerges. I'm cautious about pushing patriarchy right back into the past. I'm not persuaded that's necessarily the case. So I'm not quite sure how to respond. It's not something I've addressed, and it's not something that's easy to address. It is a really important question, isn't it? Because the risk is that if you push it right into the past, you somehow naturalize it and justify it. Whereas if it's part of a relatively recent development of state societies in recent times, or even in something coming out of the post-colonial world, it's clearly a product of societies, and therefore we can put structures in place to challenge it and revise it, as is happening, you know, as we speak. It's a very difficult issue. I don't know what your views are. I mean, do you think patriarchy goes way back in human evolution?
I don't know.
You don't know.
I don't know. I mean, and the more difficult thing is, even if you compare ourselves with our cousins, with chimpanzees and bonobos, you find the opposite situation. I mean, chimpanzees seems to be very, let's say, patriarchal or male-dominated. Society, whereas bonobos is the opposite.
The exact opposite. That's right. So there's no real you know, precedent one way or the other. And I also think that there has been a male bias in quite a lot of biological and ecological research that have characterized many animal societies as being quite male dominated in some ways. And I suspect that's not the case, just as anthropologists have had a male bias in the past, because I think it's the same in biology as well, and in ecology. And now we've got more women who are pursuing research into, say, sexual selection. They're seeing females in the past being much more, being as dominant, as creative, and whatever, how you describe it, as the males of the species. So I think we've had a biased view of biological sciences, just as we have had of biology and the human sciences in the past.
Right. Now, let's talk about the origins of religion. As you know, I mean, when you think about the origins of religion, there is these two different approaches. Either religion is a kind of byproduct of our minds, with no adaptive value, or another approach says no, religion had an adaptive function in primitive societies or in our ancestors. So, what would be your view on that? I mean,
I think that religion, well, how do you define it? A belief in the supernatural, a belief in divine beings or supernatural powers. I think that's a product of the modern mind. Personally, I don't think early hominins like Homo erectus or Heidelbergensis or the Neanderthals had ideas about the supernatural. I don't think they believed in other worlds. And so I think it's a product of the modern mind, and I think it's a consequence of what happens to our mind when we get fully modern language. It becomes an easy way of thinking about the world. Clearly, in some places, you might say it's got adaptive value. So when we're talking about cave art in those Ice Age winters, if people are coming together for a ceremony because they believe in honoring some god or some divine being, it also brings people together. And as they come together, that's got adaptive value. They change information, they swap information, they swap personnel. It helps those societies meld and become as one, and it's clearly got adaptive value. So religion can have adaptive value, but I think what's more important is that it provides an opportunity, again, for individuals with a particular propensity to exploit these beliefs in other people's minds by claiming that they have special access to the gods, that this way of behaving is proclaimed by gods, and that although you're being oppressed and suffering at the moment, your afterlife would be fine, so don't worry about it. So I do actually have a rather Marxist attitude to religion. I do think it's been used as the opium of the people for their repression. So I think it's adaptive mainly because some individuals exploit it for their own benefit,
right?
Rather than being adaptive for the group benefits.
Right.
So we go back again to Darwinian arguments partly, yeah.
Yeah, what about the idea that has been put forward also concerning religion, that not religion in general, but especially the belief in big gods and punishing gods, you know, the gods who punish the bad and who reward the good, was a requisite for social complexity, for the development of complex societies. What do you think about this?
I've heard of that. I think it might be one path to them, but not the only one. It seems to me, once you've got to the Neolithic, once you've got to farming communities, settled communities, there's all sorts of different pathways then to further complex societies and state societies. One might be going down a strongly religious route where there's a theology of big gods emerging, and that some individuals have access to those, and these are used to control and dominate society. And I can see that that is one route by which complex societies can emerge, but it's not the only one, because otherwise you might have societies that control and dominate trade routes, for instance, or control the water supply to farming communities. I think there's probably lots of different routes to complex societies once you've got to farming societies. And that creates this immense cultural diversity we see in later prehistory and in the historic world. So yeah, I have some sympathy with it, but I don't think it's the only answer. I think there's lots of different answers. And we just end up with a very complex, diverse world once farming is there. So I always go back to the origin of the language, the origin of the farming. The rest is just the world unfolding. And it doesn't interest me that much, to be honest. I'm really interested in these early fundamental turning points in humankind, one of which is the evolution of language, one of which is the evolution of farming. The rest is history unfolding. Yeah.
Right. Let me ask you one just last question. And this has to do with violence and warfare. I mean, going back again to Steven Pinker, as you know, his book, The Best Angels of Our Nature, he put forward this idea that violence has been decreasing throughout human history, and he pictures the life of what he calls primitive people as very, very violent, and but then there is some controversy as regards the existence of warfare in the Paleolithic. I mean,
what I see in the archaeological record is that or in the ethnographic record of small-scale societies, I don't see a great deal of violence in Stone Age societies and Paleolithic societies. It's really struggled to find any evidence there. Now, that might be because the evidence isn't surviving, or it might be just because what I think is people living at quite low population densities, that there's other ways of solving disputes. They're getting into violence and warfare with each other. It's undoubtedly that when you get into the Neolithic and farming societies, you do get an increase in warfare. But I think even some of that might have been rather for show, if you like, performance, really, almost like drama rather than actual bloody warfare. I'm sure that as you go into more complex state societies, the level of warfare increases. I'm not persuaded by Pinker's arguments that in the recent times it's been decreasing at all. I don't think anybody could argue that really by looking at experiencing the world. And I know he's put lots of statistics and facts together, but others have challenged those and are not persuaded by them. And I don't personally think that in humanity, in our genomes, in what makes us human, we are necessarily a violent, aggressive species. I think it's a consequence of the societies that emerge. We don't create them; they emerge, and some of them lead to much more violence and warfare than others. But I wouldn't want to say the early human past, where there's hunter-gatherers, early farmers, was entirely peaceful. But I certainly don't think it was one dominated by violence and warfare at all. The evidence just does not exist.
Right, Stephen. That's all we have time for.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It has been a honor, a pleasure, and a privilege.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to have been invited and to talk about these big issues. Really fascinating. Thank you so much.